In this lesson, we're going to learn about volumetric materials inside of the Advanced Material Editor. Alright, so let's select our object, and let's go to the Material Editor, and we're going to choose Volumetric Materials. Now, so far we've been talking about materials that are dealing with the surface of the material, and we've been talking about the diffuse color, the reflectivity, translucency, transparency. And now we're dealing with a material that is mainly talking about the volume or density of the material itself. We're not dealing with surface properties any longer. So with that said, let's move on down into our color and density panel. So you can see here that our volumetric materials are driven by a function. So we can double click on this and choose any function that we like. And I'm just going to use that grainy fractal. And just like any other function, we can drive it by using its filter. And we could also scale it. So if I wanted to scale this up or scale it down to where it's a smaller map, we're set at 0.5 all the way across. And then we can adjust the black, gray, and white values by using the filter. We'll leave it just the way it is for right now. Now, off to the right, you'll see that we have volumetric settings. We can change the volumetric color just by switching or clicking on the swatch there. And you can change it to red if you like. It's going to be a little bit easier to see at this point. And we can change the overall density. Now, obviously, the overall density is going to change the thickness of our volume or the density of our volume. So if we adjust this up, we're going to get a very thick volume. If we drop this down, we'll have 0 volume. Now, we can't drop it down all the way down to 0. We can take it down to 0.1, where we'll get just a little bit in there. Now, I'm going to leave this at about 0.5, or I'm sorry, 5.0, sorry. And let's type that in again. There we go. And now we have fuzziness. Now, you can see here that fuzziness can be driven by a function if we want it. So if we select that, you'll see that a function has now been created to the fading out module here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and close that out because we're not ready to get into the function editor, and we're actually not going to get into that in this course. It's just outside of the scope here. So let's disconnect that, and let's go back to our slider control. Now, fuzziness is going to take our white values of our fractal or our function information, and it's going to begin to blur those white values and even those gray values there. So as I adjust this fuzziness, it's going to appear as if the volume is becoming less dense. But what's actually happening is it's just dropping back the black values, and it's kind of overtaking the gray values and getting rid of more of those white values. Now, as we take the fuzziness down to 0, you can see here that we are at full fractal information here, and that's why it appears as if it's got a spherical shape around this material here. Now, if we adjust this fuzziness, you'll see that that spherical shape begins to disappear. Okay, and this is just dealing with that information in between the fractal or the function information here. Now, quality boost is going to get rid of any noise, but it's also going to increase our render time. So if I go up to better at 4.0, we're going to get rid of a lot of noise, but again, our render time is going to go up here. Now, if I take this down to faster, we're going to get a lot of noise, but we're not going to have very good render quality. So normally, I like to stick to about 2.0 on this. Good compromise between quality and render time. Now, we also have use distance field. And the distance field, whenever this is enabled, this is basically going to control the volumetric density, and it's going to take into account the depth of inside the object itself. So the density will automatically increase as you go deeper inside the object. Now, what field depth is going to allow us to do is it's going to let us indicate the depth in which the density function reaches its maximum value. So as I go into this object, it's going to appear as if it's very dense. So if I move in with my camera here and I do a render, I can see inside of this volume, and it appears to be very dense. Now if I take this up, it's going to make this appear less dense. So I'll do another render, and it seems to be about the same, but we're getting a little bit lighter in some of these areas. Let's take a look at our pictures just to see that difference. So here is the field depth increased, and this is with it at about 20% here. So you can see that difference there. Alright, so let's go back to our material editor. And we've covered the color and density section. Now let's start to talk about lighting and effects. Now, this is going to seem very familiar. You see the origin of material and velocity of material origin, and even those global transformations. Again, these all have to deal with animating our materials. Okay? Well, primarily. Now, we can adjust the positioning of our materials just by increasing these values. So X, Y, and Z. I can take this to 5, and you'll see how that changes the transformation or the origin of this material. Take that back to 0, and here it is again. Now, velocity of material, we would use this to animate that. Okay, now the global transformation, we can adjust turbulence, rotation, and even cycling. And we've talked about those in a previous lesson already. So now, in the lighting section, this may seem pretty familiar. We're going to have diffuse, ambient, and luminous, and even our flare. So what we really need to discuss is going to be the lighting model. So the first lighting model that we have is uniform. So this lighting model is the simplest. The color of the material is going to be uniform, and it only depends on its density. Light is not taken into account when computing the color, and this, like I said, this is going to be your default. Now, obviously, it's going to take less memory and less render time to use this lighting model. So let's switch this over to shaded, and you'll see once we've done that, it's taking lighting into account, and it's also allowing us to adjust our diffuse, ambient, luminous, as well as our flare. All right. Now let's move to additive. And additive is similar to the uniform model, except that the color of the volumetric material is added to the background instead of masking it. So this is great for things like fire and other similar objects. Now let's switch over to the volume shaded, and you'll see that this appears as if it's disappearing. This is a more advanced model where the contribution of light is evaluated through the entire material instead of being evaluated only at the surface. So the color of the material can be varied inside the volume. This is ideal for fire, thick smoke, explosions, and things like that. However, volume shaded materials are a lot slower to compute than the previous lighting models that we've already talked about here. Now you'll see that this appears as if it's gone. So what we need to do is begin to adjust some of these values here. And remember, with diffuse and ambient, you always want to make sure that this adds up to 100%. So let's take this up to 80. This one's going to be at 20. We're getting a hint of that color in there. We can adjust our luminous. Try to get that to glow a little bit more. I'm getting more and more white out of that. Now we have a lot of flare in here. Let's take that intensity on our flare down and our span. Okay. Now let's hit OK. Let me zoom out here. And let's take a look at this. And you can see that this appears to be more of like a cloud puff than anything. All right. Now let's go ahead and hit Escape. Let's go to our material editor. Let's check our color here. And you'll see that the volumetric settings, there's no longer a color. So that's why it's not appearing as red. All right. Now, with that volumetric or volume shaded, you see we have volumetric color. Now this is where we can change it. So I can use this function. I'm going to go to colorful. Let's change it to that red. So I'm going to reset this color to red. And you'll see that we have that type of cloud there. So we can begin to adjust these. So let's go to 60 and 40. If you want a luminous material on this, you could do so. Make that appear as if it's being illuminated. You could adjust your intensity and your span for your flare. We'll hit OK, and let's render this out and see what we've got here. So again, this is going to be a lot slower on your render time because it is more complex to compute. Now let's go to our last lighting models here. We have hypertexture. Okay, now hypertexture is a whole new ball game altogether. This is a really advanced type of material, and this is just a really great material. Now with this hypertexture, this is kind of a mix between solid and volumetrics. This is a great way to create porous materials like corroded metal or even a sponge type of material. We can have various special effects that go along with this. So hypertextures is a big part of these materials, and that's why we're going to go ahead and take a full lesson to talk about this hypertexture model here. So I'll see you in the next lesson.